Chapter 6. Elven Entrees. "It's Santa! He has Master Jimmy, he does!" one of the elves cried out. "I told you he would want to come," Santa replied and waved. At the sight of the sleigh, all of the elves stopped what they were doing and ran to greet the team and passengers. Several cheers of "Hip hip hooray!" erupted from the gathering. Jimmy watched a small ocean of striped caps bob around the sleigh. Some were green and white, some red and white, while others were gold or silver and white. Santa motioned to the growing crowd. "Notice the caps? The stripes, particularly the white ones, those represent the snow which surround our homes year-round," he said. "Actually, quite a few of the elves build their dwellings with the snow and ice, so I guess it quite literally surrounds them." Jimmy smiled. "Master Jimmy, it's Cricken, remember me?" one of the elves called out above the chattering below. Jimmy looked towards the voice and spotted a round, smiling face with green eyes blinking up at him. A small memory of the elf came charging back, and Jimmy recalled decorating presents with him several years before. The two had sat in his parents' living room and wrapped 2 presents for his parents while Santa ate another of his mother's cookies. "Hello, Cricken," Jimmy called back and waved. "He remembers me!" the elf cheered, stumbled backwards in his enthusiasm, and vanished amongst the crowd. Santa stood when the sleigh came to a stop and raised his hands. "All right then, my friends. Let's allow the young man some food and drink before we badger him too terribly much. It's a long flight, you know." Another cheer erupted from the crowd, and the elves dispersed at once to their stoves, tables, pots, pans, and baskets. "Music!" one of the elves cried out. As Jimmy and Santa climbed down from the sleigh, Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite began to play from a source unseen. "Oh, they love this one," Santa said upon hearing the melody. "If I had to choose, I would say that this is my favorite by Master Tchaikovsky. It's pretty. One of the prettiest. You know, he caught me too one year now that I think about it," Santa said. He began to chuckle as he recalled the encounter. "I believe he was maybe 6 years old when he snuck up on me. Not only did he demand to know who I was, but he insisted on speaking with me in French. I thought this was strange, coming from such a young and clearly Russian little boy. I had no idea why he wished to use the language, but young Peter was adamant about it. Truly adamant. Not until now, all of these years later, when I listen to his compositions, do I understand why. Both the language and his music are such lovely melodic sounds. I believe he was hearing the similarities in his mind even at such an early age." Santa finished his little tale and led Jimmy through the crowd, where they found a nice pair of comfy chairs by a giant bonfire. Each was a dark ruby red with gold embroidery, wooden legs, and matching fleece blanket. Jimmy plopped into his, covered his legs, and smiled as the chair began to warm him. "Did you bring all of this with you?" Jimmy asked, motioning to the various pieces of furniture and cooking appliances. "Oh no," Santa started, but was interrupted as a small red-haired elf handed him a steaming cup of peppermint cocoa. "Thank you, Burgundy," he said to the elf, and looked back to Jimmy. No, the elves conjure all of this on their own. Never one's to be far from a good fire and cooking supplies." Burgundy returned a moment later and handed Jimmy his own cup of cocoa. Jimmy thanked the elf and chuckled as Burgundy bowed and scampered back into the throng. The two sat there for a while, sipping their drinks and watching the magical flames. Cricken reappeared and placed a small round table between the two, bowed, smiled, and clapped his hands as he ran off to gather more items. "The fire isn't melting the snow?" Jimmy asked as he stared at the thousands of suspended flakes in the air around and above the flames. "Elven fire," Santa replied. "Great for cooking, warming, and looking at. Horrible for drying your clothes, I'm afraid." Burgundy and Cricken re-emerged from the sea of elves and placed 2 gold plates of fresh bread and caramel peaches on the small table. They produced 2 sets of silverware from their pockets, laid them by each setting, and raced off again. "Oh, they've made the peaches," Santa said. "You must try them. They are astounding." Jimmy grabbed his fork and skewered up one of the steaming peach slices. When it touched his tongue, an explosion of cinnamon, ginger, and vanilla filled his mouth. "Wow! Very good," he said through a mouthful of forgotten manners. Santa roared with laughter and nodded. Yes, they are. For the next hour, elf after elf brought the two everything from salt-encrusted pretzels to tiny soufflés. There were cookies, cakes, and caramelized carrots to be had. Pies of all sorts were baked, sliced, and served. There were blueberry pies, apple pies, coconut pies, and even strawberry rhubarb pies. But Jimmy's favorites were the many flavors of fudge. Chocolate, vanilla, rum raisin, orange vanilla, and peanut butter were just a few of the flavors he was offered. The best part was that Jimmy never felt full. He could eat as much as he desired and sample everything he was offered. Nothing went to waste. The elves sang, danced, and indulged in treats. Some built snowmen, some decorated the trees, and some conjured wonderfully colored fireworks, which would swoosh, swish, and hiss into the air, where they would pop into brilliant, illuminated life. On occasion, an elf would stop by, introduce him or herself to Jimmy, and return to the merrymaking. The longer Jimmy watched, the more he remembered of the elves. There was Cricken, Burgundy, Nobble, Trip, Pimsy, Jade, and even a Max amongst the bunch. Dasher seemed especially fond of a blonde-haired elf with a blue cap and coat that made his way around the reindeer. He would stop here and there, check their teeth, and then move on. The two seemed like old friends. After a time, Santa stood and clapped his hands, took off his hat, and bowed to the elves. Brilliant as usual, my friends. Thank you all very, very much. Your new blueberry and orange cookies were stupendous. Cheers erupted. Jimmy stood and thanked the elves as well, and was answered by more applause and whistles. Now, shall we be on our way? Santa asked. There was a final eruption of cheerful shouts, and flashes of emerald green light began to sparkle and wink all about the camp. The fire was squelched, each tiny stove vanished, and the woodland clearing soon looked as pristine as the new snow had intended it to be. Even the thousands of tiny footprints disappeared. I wish I was that good at cleaning my workshop, Santa said. Jimmy laughed. I'll bet my mom wishes I was that good at cleaning my room. This brought a good chuckle from Santa. The two continued to watch as the multitude began to file towards the sleigh. One by one, the elves clambered up onto the sleigh and into a giant red velvet bag in the rear compartment. We will have to join them for a while once we're off, Santa said when he noticed Jimmy's shocked expression. In there? Jimmy asked and pointed to the bag. Santa laughed. One of the best ways to travel, if you ask me. A gift from Mrs. Claus. And don't worry, we'll all fit. Jimmy blinked and grinned. Okay. The last elf hopped into the sleigh and wiggled into the bag. Santa climbed on next and took the reins. As Jimmy boarded, he heard more festive music and laughter from inside the giant red sack. But his attention was soon directed towards the reindeer as they began speeding forward through the trees.